The cold steel of the suppressed pistol pressed against Kang-ho's temple, but he didn't blink. His eyes were fixed on the crimson blooming across the white lace collar of the girl lying in the slush. Rain turned the blood into a pale pink river that flowed toward the gutter, carrying away the life of the only person who had ever looked at him without seeing a monster. "Finish it," Kang-ho rasped, his voice cutting through the downpour like a jagged blade. He didn't reach for the weapon tucked into his own waistband, nor did he signal the 40 snipers hiding in the shadows of the surrounding skyscrapers. Instead, he reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the cold, damp cheek of the girl in the mud. The man holding the gun leaned in, his breath smelling of bitter tobacco. "The heir of the Iron Throne weeping over a nameless pawn," the assassin hissed. Kang-ho didn't look up. He only tightened his grip on the girl's lifeless hand, his shoulders shaking with a soundless, gut-wrenching grief that echoed louder than any gunshot. 3 hours ago, Kang-ho was a man of stone, a silhouette of silk and malice who viewed the city of Seoul as a chessboard where every piece was replaceable. He had been groomed to inherit a criminal empire built on silence and bone, taught that tears were a chemical weakness of the pathetic. But as he sat in the back of his armored limousine, watching the raindrops race down the bulletproof glass, a flash of yellow caught his eye, a blind girl standing on a street corner, her hands gripping a tattered white cane, while her older sister frantically shielded her from the splashing puddles. It was a scene of such raw, desperate protection that it cracked the permafrost around his heart. He didn't know then that by midnight he would be standing in a back alley, watching that protection fail, and realizing that the empire he spent his life building was worth less than a single breath from the girl who just took a bullet meant for him. Kang-ho stepped out of the car, his leather shoes splashing into a puddle that reflected the neon glare of a nearby casino. He ignored the frantic whispers of his security detail, his eyes locked on the two sisters. The older one, Min-ah, was adjusting a worn scarf around the blind girl's neck, her movements urgent and precise. Kang-ho felt the weight of the gold signet ring on his finger, a ring that symbolized his power to take lives, not save them. He walked toward them, the air around him thickening with the scent of ozone and street food. Min-ah looked up, her gaze sharpening into a protective shield as she stepped in front of her sister. She didn't see a billionaire, she saw a predator. "Move," Kang-ho commanded, but his voice lacked its usual lethal edge. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of bills, the paper crisp and cold. He held it out toward the blind girl, whose head tilted toward the sound of his voice. Min-ah didn't reach for the money. She reached for the small wooden cross hanging from her neck, her knuckles turning white. "We don't want your blood money," Min-ah said, her voice a low, steady hum. She grabbed her sister's hand and pulled her toward the subway entrance, leaving Kang-ho standing in the rain with a fistful of useless paper. It was the first time in 30 years someone had looked at him and said no. He watched them disappear into the crowd, a strange, burning sensation tightening in his chest. He turned to his lead enforcer, a man whose face was a map of scars. "Find out who they are," Kang-ho ordered, his voice returning to its frigid, mechanical tone. "And find out why the Shadow Syndicate is tracking them." The report landed on his desk 20 minutes later. The blind girl, Suji, possessed a genetic marker that a rival pharmaceutical front needed for their illegal research, a research project funded by Kang-ho's own father. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The girls weren't just random civilians, they were targets marked by the very organization he was destined to lead. He checked his watch. The abduction team was already mobilized. Kang-ho didn't call his father. He didn't call the police. He grabbed his keys and ran for the private elevator, the silence of the penthouse suddenly feeling like a tomb. He drove through the city like a man possessed, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. He found them in a narrow alleyway behind a dry cleaner, boxed in by 2 black SUVs. Min-ah was standing in front of Suji, her arms spread wide, a shard of broken glass clutched in her shaking hand. The men in the black suits laughed, the sound echoing off the brick walls. Kang-ho slammed his car into the lead SUV, the sound of grinding metal shattering the night. He stepped out of the wreckage, his eyes burning with a light his enemies had never seen. "Touch them and I'll erase your entire lineage," Kang-ho said, his voice a promise of extinction. The enforcers hesitated, recognizing the heir to the throne, but their orders came from the king himself. The lead gunman raised his weapon. Kang-ho lunged, but he was too far. Min-ah saw the muzzle flash and did the only thing she knew how to do. She threw herself in front of Suji. The bullet tore through the air and for a second the world went silent. Kang-ho reached her just as she hit the ground. He slid through the slush, his expensive suit soaking up the grime of the alley. He gathered her into his arms, his hands frantically trying to stem the flow of red. Minna's eyes searched for him, her breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. She reached up, her fingers grazing his cheek, leaving a smear of red behind. Safe. Suji, she whispered, the light in her eyes flickering like a dying candle. If you believe that Minna's sacrifice shouldn't be the end of this story, hit the like button so her bravery is never forgotten. Kang-ho looked up as the gunman stepped closer, the barrel of the pistol cold against his temple. He didn't care about the weapon. He didn't care about the men. He only cared about the blind girl crying in the corner, her hands reaching out into the empty, dark air. He felt a tear track through the mud on his face, the first one he had ever shed. It wasn't for himself. It was for the girl who died protecting a world she would never see. The assassin's finger tightened on the trigger. The rain didn't stop, but the world seemed to freeze as the click of the assassin's hammer echoed in the hollow alley. Kang-ho didn't flinch. He looked the man in the eyes, a gaze so void of fear it made the professional killer hesitate for a fraction of a second. That fraction was all the time the shadows needed. A rhythmic thwip 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 tore through the air as 3 suppressed rounds from the rooftops found their marks. The man standing over Kang-ho collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, his blood mixing with Minna's in the gutter. Kang-ho didn't look at his rescuers. He didn't look at his father's elite guard who had just disobeyed the king to protect the prince. He only looked at Minna's face, now pale as porcelain. He reached down and closed her eyes, his fingers lingering on her lids. The blind girl, Suji, was crawling toward them, her hands splashing in the puddles. Minna? Why are you so quiet? Minna, please, she whimpered, her voice a thin, fragile thread. Kang-ho caught her hands before she could touch the blood. He pulled her toward his chest, his coat wrapping around her like a shroud. She's sleeping, Suji, Kang-ho said, his voice cracking, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. She's just very tired. He stood up, the weight of the girl in his arms feeling like the weight of the entire world. He walked past the bodies, past the burning wreckage of the cars, and toward the only man who could explain why a father would hunt his own son's heart. The Iron Estate was a fortress of glass and granite, perched on a cliff overlooking the Han River. Kang-ho walked through the main gates, the girl cradled in his arms, his blood-stained clothes a direct insult to the pristine marble floors. His father, the chairman, sat at the end of a long mahogany table, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't look surprised. He looked disappointed. You've ruined a perfectly good suit for a girl who doesn't even know what color it is, the chairman said, his voice as dry as parchment. Kang-ho didn't stop until he was inches from the table. He set Suji down in a velvet chair, her hands gripping the armrests as if they were lifeboats. He leaned over the table, his face inches from his father's. You sent them to kill her, Kang-ho whispered, the words vibrating with a lethal energy. I sent them to retrieve a legacy, the chairman replied, swirling his drink. Her DNA is the key to a cure for the neurodegenerative disease that is currently eating your grandfather alive. One girl's life for the man who built this empire. It's simple math, Kang-ho. The math changed tonight, Kang-ho said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden cross he had taken from Minna's neck. He slammed it onto the table. You didn't just kill a girl. You killed the only thing that made me want to be your heir. The chairman laughed, a cold, rattling sound. You think you have a choice? You are made of my blood. You are built from my sins. You will sit in this chair because there is no one else. There is Suji, Kang-ho said. He turned to the girl, whose sightless eyes were fixed on the direction of his voice. He realized then that he didn't just have to save her life, he had to save her future. He leaned down and whispered in her ear, I'm going to take you to a place where it's always warm. I promise. If you believe that a promise made in blood is a promise that can never be broken, drop a like so this story reaches those who value loyalty over power. Kang-ho turned back to his father, his hand hovering over the mahogany table. I'm taking her. And if any of your men follow us, I will burn every warehouse, every ship and every ledger you own. I know where the bodies are buried, father. I helped you dig the holes. The chairman's eyes narrowed, the glass in his hand cracking under the pressure of his grip. You'll be a pauper by morning. You'll have nothing. I'll have her, Kang-ho said. He picked Suji up and walked toward the door. As he reached the threshold he stopped. And father? Minna didn't die for your empire. She died for her sister. That's a power you'll never understand. He stepped out into the night, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him, sealing away the world of stone. The city felt different now, larger, more predatory. Kang-ho took Suji to a safe house hidden in the winding alleys of Itaewon, a place his father didn't know about. He spent the night sitting on the floor by her bed watching her sleep. Every time she whimpered in her dreams, he reached out and touched her hand, his thumb tracing the small fragile bones. At dawn his phone vibrated on the floor. A single message from his lead enforcer. The king has issued a warrant. You are no longer the prince. You are the prey. Kang-ho looked at the sunrise, the light hitting the dust motes in the air. He wasn't afraid. For the first time in his life he had something to lose, and that made him the most dangerous man in Seoul. The safe house smelled of old paper and dust, but to Suji, it was a terrifying void of unfamiliar sounds. Kang-ho watched her fingers trace the edge of the rough wooden table, her movements hesitant and jerky. He realized that for a girl who lived in darkness, the absence of her sister's voice was a physical vacuum. He reached out to help her find the water glass, but he stopped himself. She needs to learn the world as it is, he thought, not as I want it to be. Where is the light? Suji asked suddenly, her voice a small hollow echo in the room. Kang-ho leaned back against the wall, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol. The sun is coming up, Suji. It's orange and warm. Can you feel it on your face? She tilted her head, the morning light catching the gold in her irises. It feels like a memory. Minna used to tell me that orange was the color of a hug. She turned toward him, her sightless gaze piercing through his armor. Who are you? You sound like the man from the rain, but your voice is softer now. I'm the man who's going to make sure you never have to hide in an alleyway again, Kang-ho said. The door to the safe house creaked. Kang-ho was on his feet in a second, his weapon leveled at the entrance. It was Han, his lead enforcer, his face pale and his breathing heavy. He wasn't alone. Behind him stood a woman in a white lab coat, her eyes darting around the room in a panic. She's the head of the project, Han gasped, leaning against the doorframe. She's the only one who knows the truth about the genetic marker. Your father, he's not trying to cure your grandfather, Kang-ho. He's trying to refine a neurotoxin. Suji isn't the key to a cure. She's the blueprint for a weapon. The room went cold. Kang-ho looked at the doctor, then at the innocent girl sitting at the table. The scale of the betrayal was so vast it felt like the floor was falling away beneath him. A weapon. Kang-ho repeated, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Her blood produces a natural protein that stabilizes the most volatile chemical compounds, the doctor explained, her voice shaking. With her DNA, your father can create a gas that leaves no trace, a toxin that targets the nervous system in seconds. He doesn't want to save his father. He wants to be the only man left standing in the world. Kang-ho felt a surge of nausea. He had spent his life serving a man who viewed his own family's blood as a laboratory ingredient. He looked at Suji, who was clutching the wooden cross so hard her knuckles were bleeding. We have to move, Han said. The syndicate tracked the doctor. They'll be here within the hour. If you think Kang-ho should take Suji and disappear instead of fighting a war he can't win, drop a like so the world knows that peace is the ultimate victory. Kang-ho didn't move. He looked at the doctor, then at the map of the city on the wall. He realized that disappearing wasn't an option. As long as the research existed, Suji would always be a target. As long as his father breathed, the world was in danger of a silence it could never wake up from. We're not running, Kang-ho said, his voice hardening into the iron he was born from. We're going to the laboratory. We're going to burn the blueprint. He turned to Suji and knelt in front of her. He took her hands in his grip steady and warm. I have to leave you for a little while, Suji. Han is going to take you to the coast. There's a boat waiting. You'll be safe there. No. Suji cried out, her fingers locking around his wrists. Everyone who leaves me never comes back. Minna, she's not sleeping, is she? I can smell the rain and the iron on your clothes. I know what that means. Kang-ho felt a sharp pain in his chest, a sensation more agonizing than any bullet. He pulled her into a hug, his face buried in her hair. I'm coming back, Suji. I promise on the cross you're holding. I'll find you. Even if I have to walk through the dark to do it. He stood up and handed her to Han. He didn't look back as they left. He couldn't. If he saw her face one more time, he wouldn't be able to do what needed to be done. He turned to the doctor, his eyes two shards of frozen glass. Lead the way. We're going to destroy his kingdom. The laboratory was hidden beneath a luxury shopping mall in Gangnam, a place of neon and consumerism that masked the rot beneath. Kang-ho moved through the corridors with the efficiency of a ghost, his suppressed weapon barking in the dark. He wasn't the prince anymore. He was the Reaper. He reached the main server room, the heart of the research. He began to plant the incendiary charges, the timers ticking down like a heartbeat. You always were a sentimental fool, Kang-ho. He spun around. His father was standing in the doorway, surrounded by a dozen silencers. The chairman looked tired, his eyes shadowed by the flickering lights of the servers. "You're destroying $1 billion investment for a girl who won't remember your name in a year," the chairman said. "She won't have to remember my name," Kang-ho said, his thumb hovering over the detonator. "She'll just remember the feeling of the sun. And that's enough." The silencers raised their weapons. Kang-ho looked at the wooden cross he had kept in his pocket. He thought of Minna. He thought of Suji. He pressed the button. The blast didn't just tear through the concrete, it shattered the illusion of the chairman's invincibility. Fire erupted from the server racks, a wall of white heat that consumed the data, the chemicals, and the blood-stained legacy of the Iron Throne. Kang-ho was thrown back by the pressure wave, his lungs screaming as the oxygen was sucked out of the room. He scrambled for cover behind a lead-lined cabinet, the roar of the inferno drowning out the screams of the silencers. He looked through the shimmering heat and saw his father. The chairman wasn't running. He was standing in the middle of the flames, watching his life's work turn into ash. He looked at Kang-ho, a strange twisted smile on his lips. You actually did it," the chairman whispered, his voice lost in the roar of the fire. "You finally became a king. You destroyed what you couldn't control." "I'm not a king," Kang-ho choked out, the smoke stinging his eyes. "I'm just a brother." He dived through a service hatch as the ceiling began to buckle. He crawled through the ventilation shafts, the heat searing his skin, until he tumbled out into the cool night air of the mall's parking garage. He didn't stop to breathe. He ran for the stolen motorcycle he had parked nearby, the roar of the engine a desperate cry for the girl waiting on the coast. The drive to Incheon was a blur of neon and speed. He reached the docks just as the sun began to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in the orange hug Suji had described. He scanned the pier, his heart hammering against his ribs. The boat was still there. He saw Han standing by the gangplank, his hand on his holster. And then he saw her. Suji was sitting on a crate, her head tilted toward the sound of the waves. She was wearing a new coat, a bright yellow one that made her look like a piece of the sun. Kang-ho stepped off the bike, his legs shaking. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the wooden planks. Suji stood up, her hands reaching out. "Kang-ho," she whispered. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just walked into her arms and fell to his knees, his forehead resting against her shoulder. He felt her small hands touch his face, her fingers tracing the burns and the soot. "You smell like the fire," she said, her voice trembling. "But you're cold. You're shaking." "I'm here," Kang-ho whispered, his voice a ragged sob. "I'm back, Suji. I found the way through the dark." Subscribe if you want to see more stories about people who find their light in the middle of a storm. He stood up and led her onto the boat. As the engines hummed to life and the coastline began to recede, Kang-ho looked back at the city. The smoke from the laboratory was a thin black line against the sunrise. He took the wooden cross from his pocket and pressed it into Suji's hand. "Where are we going?" she asked, her face toward the wind. "To a place where nobody needs to be a blueprint," Kang-ho said. "To a place where we can just be people." They spent the next few months in a small cottage on a remote island in the Philippines. Kang-ho traded his silk suits for cotton shirts and his pistol for a fishing net. He taught Suji how to walk in the sand, how to listen to the difference between a high tide and a low tide, and how to feel the colors of the flowers she couldn't see. But the shadows of Seoul weren't easily outrun. One evening as the sun was setting, a sleek black boat anchored in the bay. Kang-ho watched it through binoculars, his body tensing with a familiar lethal instinct. He saw a man step onto the sand, not a silencer but a lawyer he recognized from the estate. Kang-ho met him at the water's edge, his hand hidden behind his back. "The chairman is dead," the lawyer said, holding out a leather briefcase. "He left everything to you. The empire, the accounts, the throne. You are the wealthiest man in Asia, Kang-ho." Kang-ho looked back at the cottage. He saw Suji standing in the doorway, laughing as she tried to catch a butterfly she could only hear. He looked at the briefcase, a symbol of the blood and the fire that had almost consumed him. "Tell them the prince is dead," Kang-ho said, his voice as steady as the ocean. "He died in the fire with his father. But the money, the power? I have everything I need," Kang-ho said. He turned and walked back to the cottage, leaving the lawyer standing alone on the beach. He reached the porch and sat down beside Suji. She leaned her head on his shoulder, the scent of sea salt and jasmine around them. "Who was that?" she asked. "Just a ghost," Kang-ho said. He took her hand and pointed it toward the horizon. "Can you feel that, Suji?" That's the color of a hug. She smiled, a real radiant smile that made the sun seem dim. And in that moment, in that quiet corner of the world, the cold Mafia Heir finally found the one thing his father could never buy. He found peace. He looked at the small wooden cross resting on the table between them. He thought of Mina, and he knew that she was finally resting too. The debt was paid. The story was finished. And for the first time the light was enough. The weapon his father had tried to create was meant to target the very system that allowed Suji to feel the world, but in the end, it was her ability to feel, her resilience and her love, that had dismantled the machine. Kang-ho realized that the most powerful toxin in the world wasn't a gas or a chemical. It was the coldness of a heart that forgot how to weep. And as he watched the stars come out, he knew he would never be cold again. If this story broke your heart and then mended it, leave a like so I know to tell more stories like this. The boat in the bay eventually turned around and disappeared into the night. The city of Seoul continued its frantic dance of neon and greed, but on that small island, there was only the sound of the waves and the breathing of a girl who had finally found her son. Kang-ho closed his eyes, his hand in hers, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't looking for a shadow. He was just home. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of the sea through the open door. Suji reached up and touched the scar on his temple, the one from the alleyway. "You're not weeping anymore," she whispered. "No," Kang-ho said, kissing her forehead. "I'm finally awake." The light of the moon reflected in the wooden cross, a silent witness to a promise kept. And as the night deepened, the man who was born for a throne realized that the only crown worth wearing was the trust of a child. He didn't need the money. He didn't need the power. He just needed the morning. And as he sat there in the quiet, he knew that the morning would always come. For Mina. For Suji. And finally for him. The genetic marker his father had obsessed over was no longer a secret of a corporation. It was a part of a girl who was now free to grow, to learn, and to live a life that wasn't defined by a microscope. The blueprint was gone, but the person remained. And that was the greatest victory of all. Kang-ho stood up and carried her inside, the door closing on the world he had left behind. The fire was out. The ice was melted. There was only the warmth of a life truly begun. The wooden cross on the table rattled as a low, mechanical hum vibrated through the cottage floor. Kang-ho's eyes snapped open. He didn't reach for a light. He reached for the knife hidden in the upholstery of his chair. The tropical night, usually filled with the rhythmic chirp of cicadas, had fallen into a deafening, unnatural silence. He looked at Suji, still breathing softly in the bedroom, her face untroubled by the encroaching dark. He slipped out the back door, his bare feet making no sound on the sand. 300 yards out in the bay, the water was being sliced by the hull of a silent electric submersible. No lights. No flags. Only the shimmering bioluminescence of the disturbed plankton betrayed its path. Kang-ho felt a familiar, cold weight settle in his gut. The lawyer hadn't been a messenger. He had been a beacon. He retreated to the shed behind the cottage and pulled a floorboard. Beneath the dust lay a heavy pelican case he had hoped to never open again. He clicked the latches. The matte black finish of a subcompact rifle stared back at him. "Just when I thought the blood had washed off," he hissed, the metal feeling like ice against his palms. He didn't head for the beach. He headed for the high ridge overlooking the bay. As he climbed, he saw the first of the intruders emerge from the surf. They moved in a V formation, their night vision goggles glowing like the eyes of predatory insects. These weren't the syndicate's thugs. They were the erasers, his father's deep cover liquidation squad. The chairman was dead, but the machine he built was still running on autopilot, programmed to reclaim the DNA marker at any cost. A flare hissed into the sky, turning the beach into a stark, flickering landscape of white and charcoal. The erasers didn't use loudspeakers. They used lead. A burst of gunfire shredded the porch of the cottage, wood splinters flying like shrapnel. Kang-ho watched from the ridge, his finger hovering over the trigger. He wasn't defending an empire anymore. He was defending a soul. He fired a single, calculated shot into the submersible's external fuel pod. The resulting explosion turned the bay into a cauldron of orange fire, backlighting the assassins. In the confusion, Kang-ho descended the ridge like a ghost. He didn't fire from a distance. He closed the gap. He caught the first eraser near the garden's edge. He didn't use a bullet. He used the knife, a swift, silent arc that severed the man's carotid artery. He caught the second man's rifle mid-swing, snapping the soldier's wrist and driving a knee into his ribs with a sickening crunch. Kang-ho was no longer a man. He was a hurricane of kinetic violence, a nightmare born of the very training they had used to create the squad. Kang-ho. Suji's scream pierced through the sound of the waves. He turned. A third assassin had bypassed the perimeter and was dragging Suji toward the treeline. She was fighting, her small hands scratching at the man's tactical mask, the yellow coat he'd bought her now stained with the grime of the struggle. If you believe that some sins can only be washed away in the blood of those who refuse to stop hunting the innocent, hit the like button so Kang-ho's path stays true. Kang-ho didn't aim for the man's head. He aimed for the leg. The shot rang out and the assassin collapsed, releasing Suji. Kang-ho was on him in seconds, his boot pinned to the man's throat. He didn't look at the killer, he looked at Suji. She was trembling, her sightless eyes wide with a terror that broke his heart all over again. The captured eraser gasped for air under Kang-ho's boot. He fumbled for a device on his wrist, a digital uplink flashing a countdown. You can't stop it, the man choked out, a bloody grin stretching across his face. The black box protocol. If the chairman dies and the project isn't recovered, the entire island is mapped for a kinetic strike. Satellite 4 Echo is already locked on. Kang-ho looked up at the star-studded sky. Somewhere up there, a cold, unfeeling piece of orbital hardware was adjusting its mirrors, preparing to drop a rod of tungsten that would turn this paradise into a crater. How long? Kang-ho rasped. 7 minutes, the eraser hissed. There is no override. The king wanted his secrets buried with him. Kang-ho looked at the boat in the bay. It was damaged, but the comms array was still standing. He grabbed Suji and ran for the water. He didn't explain. He didn't have time for words. He threw her into the small skiff and rowed with a frantic, bone-deep desperation. They reached the submersible's wreckage. Kang-ho scrambled onto the deck, his hands flying over the terminal. He didn't need to stop the strike. He needed to give the satellite a new target. He plugged his own signet ring, the one he'd kept as a final failsafe, into the console. The ring contained his father's biometrics. Accessing command interface, the computer droned. Redirect strike, Kang-ho commanded, his voice shaking. Target coordinates, the Iron Estate, Seoul. Confirmation required, the machine replied. This will result in total destruction of the primary residence. Kang-ho looked at Suji, who was huddled in the skiff, her hand clutching the wooden cross. He thought of the stone hallways, the cold mahogany tables, and the man who had tried to turn a child into a toxin. Confirm, Kang-ho whispered. The sky didn't scream, it hummed. A thin, white line of light descended from the heavens, miles away toward the horizon. Even from the island, Kang-ho felt the atmospheric pressure change. The Iron Estate, the cradle of his misery, was erased from the map in a fraction of a second. The ledger was gone. The research was gone. The lineage of the chairman was officially extinct. Kang-ho sat on the deck of the burning sub, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at his hands. For the first time they felt light. Is it over? Suji asked from the skiff. The ghosts are gone, Suji, Kang-ho said. He climbed back down into the small boat and took the oars. There's nothing left to hunt us. Subscribe if you believe that sometimes you have to destroy your past to give someone else a future. They rowed back to the shore as the sun began to rise again. The cottage was a wreck, the garden trampled, but the island remained. Kang-ho spent the next few days burying the erasers in unmarked graves far from the house. He didn't want their bones near the place where Suji learned to laugh. 2 years later, the island had reclaimed the scars. The cottage was rebuilt, now reinforced with stone and wrapped in a veranda overflowing with bougainvillea. Kang-ho sat on the steps, his hair longer now, his face tanned by 1,000 suns. He watched Suji. She wasn't sitting on a crate anymore. She was moving through the garden with a confidence that seemed impossible. She stopped in front of a cluster of hibiscus. She didn't touch them. She just leaned in and inhaled. Red, she said. Kang-ho smiled. How do you know? Because red smells like the earth when it's been dancing in the heat all day, she replied, turning to face him. She walked toward him, her footsteps certain. She reached out and touched his face. Her fingers lingered on the corner of his eye. You're not looking for the shadows anymore, she whispered. There are no shadows left to find, Kang-ho said. He took her hand and led her to the edge of the water. The boat in the bay was gone. The lawyers were gone. There was only the sound of the ocean, a vast, blue promise that stretched into forever. If this story showed you that even the coldest heart can be thawed by the light of a single person, leave a like so I know to tell more stories of redemption. The wooden cross was still there, hanging on a post by the door, weathered by the salt and the wind. It was no longer a symbol of a debt or a promise. It was a landmark. A sign that the man who was born to be a weapon had finally chosen to be a shield. And as the sun hit the orange hug of the horizon, Kang-ho realized that he wasn't just awake. He was finally truly free.